Okay, well, thanks for coming. My name is Gary Gillette. I'm a pinch hitter here, and as you know, if you know your baseball, pinch hitters have piss poor batting averages, much worse than their players who play regularly, and much worse than the same player playing regularly. I'm standing in for Brian Chip Martin, who wrote this pretty damn good book about the 1880s Detroit Wolverines. They were the first major league club in Detroit. They have no connection to the Detroit Tigers. They appeared in the early 80s, and they won the World Series between the National League and the American Association in 1887, and after 1888 they were gone. And Brian is his author's name. I don't know why he doesn't use his nickname Chip, that's what everyone calls him. Chip has his presentation, which I think the title is great, Kidnapping Their Way to Glory, because the Wolverines literally kidnapped the core of their championship team. So I'm going to do this. I will probably have time at the end for questions. I may or may not be able to answer your questions. I'm not an expert on the Wolverines. I did read the book. I recommend it. There'll be a slide at the end to show you the book. And so off we go. Anyway, so this is what Chip calls the busy Detroit slide. Okay. Detroit in the late 80s was a very small city. It was quite busy. It was a manufacturing center. They did stoves. They did a lot of lumber. They had shipyards on the east side of Detroit, on the Detroit River, near where I live. And they also did carriages, carriages for horse-drawn vehicles, streetcars, etc. And in fact, that's one of the reasons the auto industry was able to take hold here, because there was extensive manufacturing expertise in building carriages for vehicles, which they could convert that expertise to building it for cars. So Detroit was called early on the Paris of the West. That's okay.
Go back.
No, it's all right. Look, it's all right. The Paris of the West, because as you probably know, the Midwest was called the West in Civil War times and all the way through the late 19th century. And by the late 19th century, especially when the auto industry took off, Detroit had a lot of money. And so it was called the Paris of the West because rich people here did things like buy world-class art and give it to the Detroit Institute of Arts, which now people think in Congress, in a broke-ass city like Detroit, that you have this fabulous art collection, which actually figured prominently in the Detroit bankruptcy, 8 years ago. So it says a popular destination for tours who came by ship. I guess that's true because the Great Lakes were, they had lake steamers and they would be coming across Lake Erie from New York State. One of the things about Michigan is you have a large cohort of people who have family ties to New York State, more so than Ohio or Pennsylvania, because people migrated west, and people from New York up the Erie Canal, across the Erie Canal to Buffalo or Rochester, get on a boat and take it to Michigan. And that's also because southern Michigan was not impenetrable, but a swamp that was not really cool for farming until it was drained. And northwest Ohio, east of Toledo and west of Toledo, was called the swamp was called the Great Black Swamp. So in fact, one of the vintage baseball teams in Toledo that a friend of mine plays on is the Great Black Swamp Frogs. And so, so that also impeded land travel from the south, making it more popular to come across the lakes. Detroit is known as a city of the straits, although it's one strait, the Detroit River, which is really a strait. Although you can find people say it's both a river and a strait, because it connects Lake St. Clair. With Lake Erie. So it's a river in the sense that it's fresh water, and the water ends up in the ocean, but it's a strait between two lakes, really. So there we have the second slide, is the Russell House slide, if you go back.
Okay.
And there was an early, there's a vacant lot near the Russell House, and so a lot of the early amateur teams played in Detroit on that vacant lot. The hotel apparently established a flat fee for replacing windows when they would break windows from the ball players. And this hotel was headquarters of a lot of the rich and famous, famous back then. And so they were the ones who decided to bring a professional team to Detroit. And he notes that one of the early amateur teams in Detroit was called the Early Risers, because they played and practiced before reporting to work in the morning. So Okay, so we go to downtown Detroit now. So you can see City Hall smack in the center. That City Hall was demolished in the 50s, I believe. Current City Hall is not nearly so distinguished, but you know, progress is bulldozing the old and putting up something modern. On the lower right, you see the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, which has been relocated to the middle of Woodward Avenue. The area now where this is shown is called Campus Martius. Campus as the field in the Latin, and Martius being martial, because it was a field where like Civil War units would parade and train in that. And the Soldiers and Sailors Monument was erected in 1867. It's still there. It's a beautiful monument. If you get a chance to go downtown anytime, it's worth walking around and getting up close with. Okay, so we'll go next. So this is a map of Detroit about 1880. He's got Recreation Park in the center, the long rectangle. He's got Tiger Stadium, which would be the polygon over here in the lower left, and then he's got Comerica Park, which is in the lower central. Comerica Park, of course, is now part of what they call the Stadium District, the Entertainment District. You have the Ford Field where the Lions play just to the east of that, and you have Little Caesars Arena where both the Pistons and the Red Wings play. I believe they say Detroit's the only city in the country with four major league teams, the four major league teams all playing downtown. I think it's a minor distinction. There are some cities that have all four teams, but anymore, not all major cities have all four professional sports leagues, the major leagues. Although some people consider Major League Soccer a major league, and it's getting there. So he notes here that the earliest ballpark the Tigers played in was a park called Boulevard Park or League Park. It was to the east, so this is north is up. So we'd be to the east about 3.5 miles. And League Park was built, it was one of those cheap wooden ballparks, you know, they nail it together in about 3 weeks, and when they leave about 2 weeks later, it's gone because either they or somebody else salvaged all the boards for building something else. Boulevard Park is now, the site is now the Church of the Messiah, an important African-American church in the east side of Detroit community. It's within sight of the condo I live in along the Detroit River. And Boulevard Park, the Tigers started playing there in 1894 in the Western League. They were not called the Tigers in 1894, they were called the Creams. Mostly they were called the Detroits, as we know. In 1895, they got the name Tigers. For many years, people had said that the Tigers got their name because someone equated their orange socks or the orange parts of the uniform with the Princeton Tigers, which have, I guess, orange and blue as their colors. That is not true. The Tigers reportedly were named after a militia unit at the Michigan Light Guard Armory, which is on the northern part of Detroit now. Well, the National Guard Armory. So, next we have Harper Hospital, which is one of the major hospitals in Detroit. There is still a Harper Hospital now in the Detroit Medical Center, which contains, take your pick, I think about 10 hospitals, including the Carmanis Cancer Hospital and an eye hospital and rehab center, but Harper Hospital still exists in a different form. That building is long gone, and this building was part of land that had been the Brush family farm. Okay, next. Here's a map of the area, so you can see where Harper Hospital is. And this is going to be north to your left. Yeah, oh yeah, he's got the arrow on the bottom. Okay, so right now, this whole area where the recreation park was in Harper Hospital is all part of the Detroit Medical Center campus. And the streets have been redone. So it looks nothing like this. Next. And this is a drawing of Recreation Park from the Post and Tribune. And of course, like many parks then, they played on the infield of a horse racing track or he says harness racing, so maybe they didn't have thoroughbreds, I don't know. And this was an attempt to, by businessmen to make money. Again, north is to your left, and you'll see the main entrance to the park is to the right. So a recreation park opened in 1879, and it's a 3/4-mile track enclosing a baseball diamond, a cricket pitch, a skating rink, and a gymnasium. I don't know where the gymnasium was. So it's on the lower left corner lower right corner of the diagram, the lower left corner of the ballpark there. I didn't know there was a gymnasium. That was pretty good. Okay, next. So we have a sketch of Bill Hollinger, who to me looks like Teddy Roosevelt, except for the fact that he's bald. Hollinger was a billiard enthusiast turned baseball manager who came to Detroit looking to recruit talent for his Cleveland team for 1879. But while he was in Detroit, his baseball business partner back home abandoned him, so Hollinger decided to form Detroit's first professional team. And this coincided with the opening of Recreation Park, whose backers were looking for attractions to lure the paying public. And so the Hollinger Nine had their home park, and professional baseball in Detroit was off and running. Okay, this is the main entrance to Recreation Park on Brady Street. This had a clubhouse in it because, of course, baseball was a club sport in a real sense back then, along with a boardroom, locker room, they call change rooms, restaurant, a smoking room, and a ticket office. The park occupied 18 acres, Chip says. And this is the half-mile sign at Recreation Park on the 3/4-mile harness racing track. There are actually a number of cool photos of Recreation Park, more so than we have for lots of other parks around this time. And you can see the main entrance there, the building to the left center ground. And again, the main entrance. I love the guy seeing the window above. I can't tell whether he's watching things or whether he's there to spit on people who don't seem like to be of the right social class. And of course, the guys with the top hats and everyone all dressed up, this kind of thing freaks me out now because ball games are anything but that. So, and the entrance building was bulldozed in 1894, but of course the Recreation Park was gone by then too. All right. So this is an ad for the Hollinger team taking on Boston. It doesn't say what team that was. 4:30 sharp. They started the games, as you people will know, late in the afternoon to take advantage of people who could get off work early, or people who had went in on earlier than normal. And because the games were so fast, they had no problems with daylight. So the Hollinger team disbanded before 1879. So we have Mayor Thompson. Detroit has a long history of mayors because for most of its history, the mayors were 2-year offices, and a lot of mayors quit, resigned to take higher office, or resigned in scandal, and then the president of city council would replace them, and then you'd have an election. So, for example, earlier this century, we had 3 mayors in a period of like 2 years, because Mayor Kilpatrick was forced to resign because of the scandal. We then had the president of city council, Ken Cockrell Jr., who became mayor and ran for the vacancy, and he was defeated by Dave Bing, the NBA Hall of Famer, some of you may remember, who lived in the Detroit suburbs and moved into Detroit supposedly to run for mayor. I mean, there's a lot of people who believe he still lived in the suburbs when he was mayor. And he won the election, and then he won the election for the next term. So Mayor Thompson was a lawyer, what a surprise, and he was elected in 1879. Here is the 1880 application to the National League for admission. And the mayor was president of the Detroit Baseball Club. Okay, here again is a drawing, a really beautiful drawing of City Hall. Let's see, So Thompson was mayor from 1880 to 1883 while he was running the team. Can you imagine now having a mayor like the mayor of Detroit running the Tigers? It's more like the Tigers owned by the Illiches run the city. It's sort of the reverse. And this is, he ran it from City Hall, according to Chip's research. And the Wolverine, we're going to see something about that. The Wolverine was a team nickname, however, mostly was referred to as the Detroits. Now here, Chip puts in a ringer, a picture of a University of Michigan Wolverine football player, which of course they're known nationwide for their nickname and their colors. People from Michigan say that's maize and blue. People from East Lansing, where I was at Michigan State, my wife and I are from Michigan State, call it corn and blue. There were bumper stickers for many years saying, you call it maize, we call it corn, you know. And this is a picture of a real Wolverine, and these are miserable little, I shouldn't say that word, my mom would not like it. These are miserable little bastards, and they are really ferocious. They can kill animals several times their body weight. Now, Chip has done more research on this than I have, but I wasn't aware that the first wild one wasn't found in Michigan until 2004. I have been told, and I believe most people in Michigan believe, that the Wolverines were native to the state, but they were pushed out by the settlers in the early 19th century. But apparently those reports or sightings of Wolverines before 2004, and I believe this one was not part of a nesting pair or whatever, so I don't think there's been any other sightings. So apparently what I was told was not true, that there's no documented sightings of Wolverines in Michigan. Although they lived around the upper Midwest, so it seems to me it's entirely possible they were here. Anyway, no one really knows how the name got to be popular in Michigan. And of course, Michigan is known as both the Great Lakes State and the Wolverine State. When I was an undergrad at Michigan State, the yearbook was called the Wolverine, which irritated everyone in both Ann Arbor and East Lansing, because in East Lansing, it was irritating to have people think that our yearbook was named after the Michigan team, and in Michigan, they hated the fact that our yearbook was named the Wolverine. So when I was there, I wasn't on the yearbook staff, I was on the Red Cedar Log, the literary magazine staff. They changed the yearbook name to the Red Cedar Log. Red Cedar is a river that flows through campus. Red Cedar Log sounds pretty boring to me, but they didn't ask me. So this is the Toledo Strip. This is a little-known piece of history. There was a war, quote, and raised eyebrow quotes here, between Michigan and Ohio about a strip of land that apparently some drunken surveyor hadn't gotten the survey right. And the city of Toledo was in it, and there was an argument whether this belonged to Michigan or to Ohio. And supposedly the only shots were fired killed somebody's cow. That's the old story. And although there was saber rattling between Michigan and Ohio, and ultimately there was the dispute was settled by Ohio getting the Toledo Strip and Michigan being given the Upper Peninsula. So if you know your geography, this explains why Michigan has something that really should be part of Wisconsin. And many Upers would say they should be part of Wisconsin, right? Yeah, he doesn't have the cow in here. The cow story is too long not to tell it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't remember the owner of the cow. They should have an owner like Mrs. O'Leary, but they don't. And so Chip says, for some reason, the Ohio militia began calling Michigan Wolverines, likely as an insult because the animal is viewed as obnoxious, which it is. And Michiganders adopted it. I have to say that one of the things, I'm writing a new book on history of the Negro Leagues and the Detroit Stars, Negro Leagues in Michigan, which is really Detroit. But one of the earliest black teams in Michigan and the earliest well-known professional team was the Page Fence Giants, 1895 to 1898. And they were in Adrian, Michigan, which you see Brownstown. It's basically west of Brownstown. Oh no, Adrian, it's on the map there, I'm sorry. It's west of Monroe, just north of the Toledo Strip. It fooled me because of the red thing. Threw me off at the border. Anyway, Adrian, some business people sponsored this team, Page Fence, which manufactured woven fence, the kind of fence you would see like as a lattice work, as a competition to barbed wire, which they said hurt animals was more expensive. And so Page Fence sponsored this team, And so when I was doing some research on this, I found that Adrian and Monroe had a real bitter rivalry in the late 19th century between their town teams. And there was an article in the Adrian paper talking about going to Monroe, and they called the Monroe fans French, I think it was Frenchies, dudes, and Wolverines or something like that. But being called French back then, which was really the first white citizens or settlers in Michigan were French, coming up the Great Lakes. They didn't come overland. Calling people French back then was an insult, as it is today apparently. And calling them a dude was bad news too. So there's a bitter rivalry between Adrian and Monroe, and they competed to treat the other's fans badly when their teams played at their town. So this is the Upper Peninsula, of course, which was deeded to Michigan, which, again, at least the western 2/3 should be part of Wisconsin, if not the whole thing. And the far western part of the Upper Peninsula is in the central time zone for that reason. This is Frank Bancroft, who managed the International Association and managed NL teams, National League teams in Worcester, Mass. He was Detroit's first manager. He was there for 2 years, but the Wolverines finished 4th and 6th, and then he was let go. I didn't know this, he was one of the first managers to conduct spring training in the South. Learn something new every day. Okay, so next we're going to get to a local hero, Charlie Bennett, who was one of the best barehanded catchers in the 19th century. Not well known. I think a serious candidate for the Hall of Fame. I don't think he'll ever get in. But he was a favorite then. He was, I believe, the only or one of the few players who were with the Wolverines from their first year to the last. And back then, of course, the skill was catching the damn ball, right? Wasn't hitting. He wasn't a great hitter, but catching the ball, especially catching the fastball pitchers, the speedball pitchers, was really the skill. And Ned Hanlon with the old Judge pose photo. I love those pose photos with the ball hanging in the air. You don't get any sense it's moving, right? I mean, it's hanging on a string. But Ned Hanlon, so Hanlon was with the Wolverines from 1881 until 1888. He was a center fielder, known for his speed and base stealing. He was the captain of the team. He, of course, later went on to manage the 1890's Orioles, the championship NL club, and is in the Hall of Fame. Not for his Detroit tenure so much as a manager. This is the 1884 team. Detroit finished 7th in 1883. 1884 they finished last. They thought the team might fold, but says founding President William Thompson, of course former mayor, was bitterly disappointed, especially with the behavior and integrity of the players. So he left the club. Now, do they look like rapscallions or what? Yeah, this is another one of the great images of Recreation Park. If you think there are too many signs in the ballparks today, which I do, look at this signage. Garland sign promoted stoves. As I said, Detroit was a iron stove manufacturing place. For many years at the State Fair, there was this giant wooden stove that was a replica of a cast iron stove. It was several stories tall. I believe it's in storage now. It's been disassembled. I wouldn't swear to that. Anyway, and then there's an ad for Hudson's department store. You can see right in the center, Hudson's was downtown on Woodward Avenue. It's supposed to have been the second largest department store in the world after Macy's at Herald Square in New York. And it closed in the late 80s, I believe, mid to late 80s, when Hudson's had been one of the retail giants and had populated the suburbs. They had Hudson stores at Northland, Eastland, Westland, maybe even Southland, all over the suburbs. It drew business away from the downtown store. And the downtown stores closed, and then in the 1990s, I believe 98 was imploded, a huge implosion. Right now, Mayor Gilbert, Dan Gilbert, the billionaire owned the Cleveland Cavaliers and Rocket Mortgage. He is building a new hotel, condo, retail building on the site. At one point, it was scheduled to be the tallest building in Michigan, which would be taller than Westin Hotel, not the Westin, it used to be the Westin, the Marriott Hotel at the Renaissance Center, which is 77 stories, I believe. And it was supposed to be taller than that. Then it was supposed to be like 150 feet taller than that. Now it shrunk because the plans were made when Detroit was booming, and then you had, the predictable sort of slump because there are not enough construction trades in Detroit and because costs went up. And they just announced this week the hotel partner for that, which is Element, part of the Marriott chain. They've been talking about having a hotel in that building, but no one would commit until just this week. The building is 2 years behind schedule. However, it will eventually go up and it will, take up what they call the Hudson block, which has been a huge hole in the fabric of downtown Detroit until now. And this is Frederick K. Stearns, who replaced Thompson. Stearns was a pharmaceutical magnate. Detroit was also a home for a lot of pharmaceutical firms. In fact, Park Davis was headquartered in Detroit for many years. Their old headquarters is still down on the East Riverfront. It's now condos and offices. So he took over 1885. Stearns founded the second largest pharmaceutical firm in Detroit, probably next to what became Park Davis. His son was passionate about baseball. The Stearns family mansion, which is truly impressive, is on East Jefferson Avenue, 1 block from where I live, across Jefferson Avenue from where I live. It's a huge building. It's now taken up with offices for many nonprofits. Beautiful building. And this is Fred Stearns playing for the University of Michigan team. And he and other his teammates would play on the amateur Detroit Etnas in the summertime. As you might know, Michigan is the only Big Ten school with a really important baseball program. I'm sad to say Michigan State can't compete, and the University of Wisconsin hasn't had a Big Ten team, I think, since the 90s, maybe the 80s. So baseball isn't a priority. Michigan went to the final game of the College World Series a couple of years ago. Their pitching coach, Chris Federer, turned down an offer from the Yankees and is now the pitching coach for the Tigers in his second year. Really brilliant. We had him speak at our Saber chapter just before the pandemic, and I said, this guy is on the way to the majors, even though there was a bias at that time against hiring college coaches for major league teams. So Michigan is the last team that is not from the Sun Belt or from the West Coast to win the College World Series, except for Wichita State. In the, I think, early 90s, Wichita State won 1 College World Series. But prior to that, it had been Michigan in 1862 or 63. I don't remember, I think it's 62. And those are the only 2 northern teams to win, except for, to break the Sun Belt West Coast lock on the College World Series in the last 60 plus years. And this is Frederick Stearns in his distinguished gentleman years. Let's see if he got a name on it. No. And Chip says he's, like George Steinbrenner of the Yankees, determined to find the best players and put a winning 9 on the field in Recreation Park. Except that he did things that even Steinbrenner wouldn't do. Okay, so this is a picture of manager Bill Watkins, who was manager and owner of the Indianapolis Hoosiers. But he came to Detroit looking to buy the Wolverines. They both played, the Indianapolis and Detroit were both in the Western League, and the league was about to collapse. So he figured that buying the Wolverines, his combined club could gain entry into the National League. But Detroit, the director, not interested in selling to him, and they purchased his club for $5,000, a lot of money. And that included star slugger Sam Thompson, and Watkins became the Wolverines managers. So there was a lot of confusion, according to Chip, over the rules about swallowing up a whole club. And so they had trouble getting all the players from Indianapolis here. Now we're gonna see a map of the Great Lakes and going on a kidnap cruise. You can't make this stuff up, okay? I'm about 2/3 of the way through, so I shouldn't be too late. I'll try to speed up a bit. So the Detroit Free Press, he's got a quote from the Detroit Free Press, explained what happened to the players. They were trying to hide the Indianapolis players. It was deemed best to remove them from all outside influence, and the entire team came to the city yesterday morning with the Detroit directors. From Detroit, they proceeded by rail to Toronto, and will there take a steamer for a pleasure trip down the St. Lawrence to the Thousand Islands. They will join the Detroit Club here in the middle of next week. He said there are several versions of the steamer cruise. They're supposed to stay out of sight so nobody can sign them until this waiting period ends and the Detroit Club has sole custody of them. Stearns later said in his reminiscences that he and his new manager hired a yacht and sent the players on a cruise around Lake Michigan. And quote, some of them were far from being good sailors and were seasick most of the time. However, we kept them practically prisoners until the time limit had expired when we brought them back to Detroit where they all signed their contracts. This is Slugging Sam Thompson. One of the players held hostage. Recalled that the captives were entertained royally with food and drink. However, by the 6th day afloat, they were uneasy and demanded to be put ashore, but the captain refused. And the hostages realized they couldn't take over the ship because they were farm boys unfamiliar with sailing. And besides, they're out of sight of land and had no idea where they were. Again, you can't make this stuff up, right? And this is a map of Lake St. Clair, which is just northeast of Detroit. I didn't know this either. Apparently when the players got back, they found there were telegrams and letters waiting for them with offers from other clubs. So, this is the flat slide. And once these guys are signed, they spend time fishing in the flats. There's a low-lying delta at the north end of Lake St. Clair. You can see it up there on the upper right. I have a friend who grew up on one of the islands there, one of the large islands, Parsons Island. If you see the channel in the middle there with St. Clair Flats on it, to the right of that is Canada. There's a Walpole Island, it's a big island there, just southeast of Algonac, and that's a Native American reservation. And there's still wharf freighters and other commercial shipping going up the St. Clair River from Lake St. Clair to Lake Huron and down from Lake St. Clair on the Detroit River to Lake Erie. It's a very active shipping trade, including 1,000-foot ships. So anyway, apparently they like to fish there. So Chip speculates that it may have been that they hid them out sometime in the St. Clair Flats, but I think the boat story is both more entertaining and probably more likely, since they could have been found there and they were accessible. So now we have the Big Four, the Detroit Big Four, which really should be the Big Five because of Thompson, but these are guys that were stolen from Buffalo. Again, purloining the Hoosiers was not good enough. We're going to steal the guts of another club. So Stearns and his fellow directors learned that Buffalo Bisons were in poor financial condition and might soon drop out of the National League. So we began to pursue the Big Four hitters of Dan Browthers, it is said Browthers, Jack Rowe, Hardy Richardson, and Deacon White. And Buffalo refused to sell stars individually and wanted to load the entire franchise and all players at the same time. After protracted negotiations, Detroit agreed to acquire the Bisons for a reported $7,000. And that's just an amazingly cheap deal because Deacon White's Hall of Famer, Browthers Hall of Famer. I mean, this is like getting, like, maybe not quite Ruth Gehrig, Lazzari and Musial or something like that from the Yankees. It's just an amazing heist and makes Detroit, a dominant club.
I'm not hearing you.
So they were, again, by a league rule, not able to play for a while, so they had to sit out until October 20th. So again, the Detroit management kidnapped these guys or persuaded them to disappear until they could be signed by the Wolverines and not signed by anyone else.
Are we a slide ahead?
I think you are.
I thought this was a repeat, right?
Right, now, yeah, this is the 1886 team slide. So they also acquired second baseman Fred Dunlap from St. Louis, and they had a powerhouse team. They really were strong teams, big hitters and solid pitching. And the players started to rebel against Watkins' strict discipline. So next we have the 1887 Wolverines cameo. So the 1886, this is 1886 club, I'm sorry. They finished second place, 2.5 games back of the White Stockings, so they hadn't yet put it all together. This is an 1886 game at Recreation Park, and note the rooftop stand, which I presume he's referring to up here, because this is not, that is really high up. I wonder if it's an outlaw stand, you know, where they used to build them across the street so you wouldn't have to pay. Yeah, it said the Detroit directors went to court, but of course they could not get the courts to agree to enforce that. Interestingly enough, supposedly when the Comerica Park was built, the Tigers complained both about people at the Detroit Athletic Club, which is the most prestigious private club in Detroit, which overlooks Comerica Park, watching games from their upstairs windows, as well as people watching games from a parking garage across the street. I don't know if that's true or not. I wouldn't be surprised, but.
Yeah, you can still see the Detroit Athletic Club people. When because my seats are right behind home plate, you can see people.
Oh, yeah, no, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And if, like maybe 5 years ago, Detroit Athletic Club put a rooftop restaurant up
Yeah.
there. It's a beautiful place
Yeah.
to watch a game. It's actually beautiful just to sit there and look into Comerica Park. The Michigan Opera Theater, which is 2 blocks from the ballpark, actually has rooftop seating, which they sell to make a few extra bucks when the Tigers are playing. Okay, so here's the 1887 game. So the league conspired against Detroit to impose a new gate sharing formula, so targeting Detroit because of its free spending. Stearns had bypassed the cap on player salaries using personal services contracts. His payroll was 50% higher than any other team. This is like the Yankees, again, without Steinbrenner stealing players. This is an advertisement for clothing, for a clothing merchant, piggybacking on the popularity of the 1887 Wolverines. This is the champions of the National League, and they don't have to say National League. They just say the league, because the National League has always viewed itself as the original and most important league, even though the American Association, 1882 to 1891, was considered a major league. It's just the league, right? The Detroit won the NL pennant, winning 79 games, finishing 3.5 games ahead of the Phillies. And here are the American Association champions, St. Louis Browns. They finished 14 games ahead of Cincinnati. Here is Tip O'Neill, who batted .435, 14 home runs, 167 runs, 123 runs batted in, slugging .691. Tip O'Neill's batting average is controversial. 1887 was the year in which walks were counted as hits for that year only, and then someone 20 years ago made a stupid decision to count that in total baseball. This is a book recently published about Tip O'Neill and the Browns. I haven't read it yet, I just got in. The author, Dennis Thiessen, seems like a good guy, knows his stuff. I saw a presentation he did recently, so you might check this out. Here is the formal slide for 1887. I don't know about you, but I love these photographs. These guys look so serious, and I'm envious of their mustaches. Detroit went into first place on May 4th, never left first place. They were very popular on the road, but they had trouble drawing at home, and so the club finances began to get shaky. And so the owner of the Browns, Chris Van Der Ahe, And Stearns, the owner of Detroit, came up with a plan for a World Championship Series to milk every cent out of postseason play. This is the famous 15-game World Series, longest ever, where they played every game regardless of it being past the point of decision. They also played in multiple other cities. Not sure how many games they played. I think it was at least 7 or 8 cities they played in. And by the 15th game, there were 659 fans attending. Of course, the decision point had been reached like 4 or 5 games earlier. And the Wolverines, the Browns had won the World Series the previous year. It says that St. Louis stole 581 bases that year. Of course, different definition, but they were shut down by Charlie Bennett's strong arm. Here is, well, that slide was the pennants being hoisted at Recreation Park at the start of the 1880 campaign. That's a big ass flag. It's not supposed to be bigger than the American flag. In fact, 2 of them are bigger than the American flag. Yeah, 2 of them. You wouldn't get away with that today. So this is the 1888 Wolverines slide in Boston in front of that's the South End grounds, I believe, right? Which I love the grandstand, the ornateness of this kind of Victorian architecture translated to a ballpark. So the Wolverines roster was intact, but the players wanted Watkins sacked because of discipline, and so they finally gave up because the director refused to fire him. The season wasn't good. They're trying to repeat as league champions. Watkins fired pitcher Pretzels Getzine. Now Pretzels has got to be one of the greatest nicknames ever. $100 for what he called back talk. I wish I could have fined my kids $100 for back talk. I would be rich. And this is taken in June in Boston. And as you can see that 2 of the players, photos were added later, they had someone sit in there with a Detroit uniform and they cut and pasted their heads on Dan Browthers and Lady Baldwin. Lady Baldwin, another great name for a ball player, in the center back and center middle. This is 5th place team. Of course, they're advertising league champions because they're league champions in 1887. They're still league champions until a new World Series is played. And so after 1888, because of the finances, the team owners sold off the club to Cleveland, the franchise. So Cleveland replaced Detroit, and the players were dispersed. So this is pretty remarkable. You have a dominant club full of huge stars and Hall of Famers winning the league, winning the World Series, and a year later it's gone. People sometimes say the club moved to Cleveland. Did not. It was, the club essentially was disbanded, was replaced by Cleveland. And this is Charlie Bennett first pitch. You may know Charlie Bennett lost parts of both his legs in a train accident where he fell underneath a train. And that ended his baseball career, but it didn't end his career as a celebrity. The fans in Detroit still loved him. Bennett Park, Detroit's, which was a precursor to Navin Field, Brick Stadium, and Tiger Stadium, on the site of Michigan and Trumbull. Bennett Park opened in 1896. They played, as I mentioned, they played the Detroit Creams, and the Tigers played 2 years at Boulevard Park on the east side. And Bennett would throw out the first pitch on opening day for many years. You can sort of see the fact that he's on prosthetic legs because of his very stiff gait. He passed away in 1927. Said that he threw out the first ball opening day every day until 27, so I don't doubt that. In 1893, Detroit tried to get another entry in the National League. It failed, but by next year, of course, Van Johnson was planning to challenge the National League, and he started the Western League, which in 1900 became the American League, and in 1901 declared itself a major league and challenged the National League head on. The site in Michigan and Trumbull was a former Haymarket. They said that early on you could, if the infield dirt was washed away, you could frequently have balls bouncing off cobblestones underneath the dirt from the Haymarket. All right, so this is an aerial view of the Detroit Medical Center, and this is looking north. So Recreation Park is basically in here, would have been in here. Oh, there's a pin, I'm sorry, pin there, it would have been that stretch. There's an historic marker in there, you have to go a roundabout way to see it. There's the historic marker. You have to walk to it, you can't drive to it. Which in Detroit is like a sin, right? So there's a text on the historic marker. He says it's probably close to a half-mile sign that we saw on the track before. And this is, this is just another shot of the Wolverines playing at Recreation Park. Next slide is going to be Chip's book. Ryan, I got to talk to him about that name thing. It's a good book. I mean, if you're interested in 19th century Major League Baseball, it's a good book. Although I've given away the highlights. The kidnapping stuff is the best. Chip also, and I figure this crowd would be interested, has another book that I just finished reading. I recommend, Baseball's Creation Myth, where he both disassembles the Abner Doubleday myth, which is no big thing. People have done that been doing that since it was first promulgated in the early 20th century. But he also points out that it's very likely, although he can't be certain, that Abner Graves, the guy who wrote the letter to Al Spaulding with unverified details by Abner Doubleday, yada yada, that he was consciously or subconsciously using the story of a game in Beachville, Ontario, which the people in Canada call their first baseball game, which was touted by another guy who lived in Denver, was a member of, I think, the Shriners, of a social organization, and had an office a block away from Abner Graves. Graves shot and killed his second wife because she annoyed him. Ended up dying in a hospital, a criminal hospital or a prison. And Adam Ford, the Canadian who told the story a few years earlier in a letter to the Sporting Life, which people ignored, about the game in Beachville, the similarity between their stories are very, very strong. Adam Ford was accused of poisoning a person he didn't like in St. Mary's, Ontario, and he ultimately fled to the US, ended up running a sanitarium in Seattle, which failed under weird circumstances, maybe because patients were dying, because maybe they were giving poisonous drugs as treatments. So you can't make this up. It's a good book. It's a good book. Anyway, thank you for putting up with me, and if you have any questions, I'll attempt to answer them. I don't know how much time we have.
7 minutes.
7 minutes? Okay, I can probably fake it that long. So, any questions?
Just not really a question, but a couple interesting facts about a couple of the players that you mentioned there in the presentation that played for the Wolverines. Dan Browthers.
Brothers, I think. That's what they say around here. So
He actually held the distinction that Babe Ruth broke his career home run record. I believe he had 106, and that's when Babe Ruth. That's who he.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was a big slugger. I mean, these were big time sluggers.
Yeah, he was, and for that time period. Yeah, he was. And Deacon White. I was collect old baseball memorabilia, and when I was doing my history research on catching equipment, he was a catcher for the Wolverines. Deacon White was, and
He also played third base. I think in 1880 he played more third base than catcher. But yeah, he did. He was a catcher. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a story about his wife. That's at the beginning of equipment, the evolution of catching equipment with the mask and the chest protectors. And it was kind of frowned upon for catchers to use equipment during that time period. And his wife made him a chest protector that he wore under his uniform to hide it.
You're saying this was for White?
Yes.
See, I thought that Charlie Bennett was credited with the invention of the chest protector, but I could be wrong.
Well, he didn't. Not that he invented it.
Oh, I see.
But she made him one to.
Very
Like that.
clever. Yeah. Yeah, Peter
And
Morris,
he hid it underneath his uniform.
Peter Morris, who lives in Lansing, is one of the foremost experts in the
I've been
19th century. And Peter's got a great book called Game of Inches. And basically he tracks the first of everything you can imagine in baseball. And it's far more authoritative. If you see somebody say this is the first time this phrase was used, this is the first time this happened, get a copy of Game of Inches and look it up, because the odds are probably 80% that that's not true. And I refer to Peter's book all the time. Like I just sent him an email a week ago saying I was trying to look up something, and I could not find in his book the first time the distinction between the high minor leagues and low minor leagues was made. And it was probably the first time I ever looked for something in Peter's book that you couldn't find. It's in a wonderful book, and has tons and tons of detail about 19th century baseball and when things really happened and what is known and what is speculated on. So, yeah.
I've got
He's
two
also
copies
got a
of it.
book about just catchers too.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Right,
yeah,
Catcher,
a
which is a great
Yeah.
book, and really illuminated for me how important catchers were back then, and why back then and now, until recently with the metrics on pitch framing and on blocking. You know, Tigers manager AJ Hinch was just talking yesterday or the day before about Tucker Barnhart, who's hitting like basically $120 or something now, but early in the season. But Barnhart, and what a great pitch blocker he is. But the metrics don't show that he's a great pitch blocker. And Hinch is saying, you know, what I see, and Hinch is of course a former catcher, he's a great blocker. So this has really improved the status of catchers. But yeah, Peter's book, The Catcher, is a great book. He has a book with interest for Michigan fans on the earliest baseball teams in Michigan, well, he's got several other books. Anyway, I recommend it.
Yeah, I got them all.
But The Game of Inches is a great book. It should be on your bookshelf next to the baseball books you treasure most. Any other questions or comments?
You said you were writing a book about Negro Leagues?
I am. I'm the founder and chair of the Friends of Historic Hamtramck Stadium, a nonprofit I founded in 2012. We have been campaigning for both the preservation. Originally, I started this because it was the remaining grandstand at Hamtramck was ready to be knocked down, and hardly anyone remembered that it was a Negro League site. And then along with two colleagues, we got it put on the National Register in 2012. 2014, we had a Michigan Historic Marker. And about 2017, we being mostly the city of Hamtramck, which owns the site. The Friends, we're constantly out there agitating. We have a certain moral authority because we're not beholden to anybody, and we don't ask people for money. I mean, we don't ask the city or whatever. So 2017, a city planner in Hamtramck, no one could remember when they had a city planner before that. When she left a year later, they didn't fill the position. She applied for an African American Civil Rights grant, the first time the National Park Service was awarding them, and got $50,000, which funded most of a historic structures report on what was there, when it dated to, what condition it was in. That was the roadmap for another $500,000 National Park Service grant a couple years later, along with $400,000 plus from the Detroit Tigers Foundation, probably at the end like $700,000 or $800,000 from the Ralph J. Wilson Jr. Foundation, Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation, former owner of the Buffalo Bills, who lived in Detroit, and who donated like $1.2 billion from the sale of the Bills to a foundation that its focus is Southeast Michigan and Western New York State. That's the only place they spend their money. Plus $200,000 from Kresge, plus some money from Wayne County and $50,000 from us. Right. The grandstand is due to be reopened in the next 2 weeks. The last date I heard was May 7th.
We have a game there.
It's been postponed about 4 different times. I'd say mid-May is more likely. But we restored the field 2 years ago. You know, we had games on it for the first time last year.
Our club has played.
We played. It's awesome.
Yeah, and we spent about $50,000 last year on putting in dugouts and other stuff. We're gonna install a batting cage in the next week or so, and real bullpen mounds, built by professional bullpen mounds. I had to wince when I saw the price, $8,500 for 2 bullpen mounds, and we're getting a discount. And then when we were looking to resod the outfield, because We put new grass in the outfield and levels in the small spot, but it hasn't been professionally regraded and hasn't had new sod. And we're looking for that, subsurface drainage. Right now we have a water wheel that the guys on the ground screw haul out and sprays water everywhere, but we've been told, you know, in order to be big time, we need to have subsurface drainage and sprinklers. And then when we get all that, we're going to look for $50,000 to restore the Little League field. And from the late 40s until the 80s, Hamtramck Stadium had 4 diamonds. One in the right and left field corner facing each other, and one in center field facing home plate at Hamtramck Stadium. So you could have 3 Little League or softball games, or 60-foot diamonds, 3 Little League or softball games going on simultaneously, or 1 game on the big diamond. And we want to restore the Little League diamond center field facing home plate at Hamtramck Stadium, which was the site of the home field for the 1959 Hamtramck Little League World Series champions. The only time, Hamtramck was a big power in Little League back then, and they went to, I think, the World Series quarterfinals or finals twice in the years before that. And then the same cohort of kids 2 years later won the Pony League World Series in '61, and then in '62 the same cohort of kids are just aging up. Lost the final game of the Colt League World Series in Oklahoma, and one of the team players who was on my board until recently assures me they were robbed. So there was Pinky Darris, Art Darris, who was the star pitcher and hitter for the '59 team. I think he hit like 600, he had a home run every 3rd time up or something. He was intentionally walked all the time, of course, including with the bases loaded. And he was a star pitcher. He threw several no-hitters. He is considered by historians to be the greatest Little League player ever. Art Darris, of course, signed a professional contract. Everyone thought he was going to be a huge star. He topped out in Class A, I think. He may have made Double A. You know, like many ball players, they don't realize how tough. You're a star in Little League. You're a star at age 14 or 16 doesn't make you a star in the professional, when pretty much everyone was a stud in their local team, right? And so he became very bitter throughout all his memorabilia, which is a tragedy. But and wouldn't do interviews for decades. He was a police officer in a Detroit suburb for 30 years, retired. I got a chance to interview him when they did a documentary about the '59 team. Very gracious guy, very soft-spoken. He is still alive, retired, and we are going to name the Little League field when it's restored Art and Pinky Darris Field. The field at Hamtramck Stadium, we renamed, we got city council to agree to let us not rename, because it was never named Turkey Stearns Field. So the official name of the site is now Norman Turkey Stearns Field at historic Hamtramck Stadium. So, anyway, we have baseball games, travel team tournaments, vintage baseball, and other stuff all summer, mostly on the weekends, where we do rec soccer leagues there in the outfield. There used to be a cricket pitch in the outfield, but cricket has moved to Detroit City Park about a mile away, which is good for us because it's trying to accommodate cricket and baseball. So if you get a chance, stop by the site. And thank you again. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.